All right, so today's unit is on stress and health. So I'll start by talking about stress broadly speaking. We'll talk about several different sources of stress. We'll go over briefly the effects of stress and how to deal with stress and how these things impact your health, sort of broadly speaking. So the origins of our understanding of stress start in the early 1900s with a man named Hans Seeley. He noticed several of his patients had these similar symptoms, things like decreased appetite, um, increased fatigue, low levels of ambition, drive, general lethargy. And he couldn't find a direct biological cause. As a medical doctor, he was trained to look for acute biological causes. And so he just labeled this as sort of the condition of just being sick. Um, and what was interesting about Hans Seeley is that he found that these symptoms occurred whenever people needed to adapt to some kind of changing environmental situation. Now, ultimately, this led to our understanding of stress. So when we talk about stress, we're talking about the physiological or psychological response um, whenever we must adapt to some kind of changing conditions. Um, Importantly, these conditions can be real or perceived. So stress does not necessarily need to come from the outside world. It can be something um, that is a function of our perception of that outside world. So, for example, psychological stress is not about the situation or the person; it's the transaction between the two, right? So, psychological stress is about how we interpret the world that we live in, right? The process by which we appraise and respond. So there are two aspects. There's the physiological and the psychological components of stress. The physiological response is our fast-acting sympathetic nervous system. So this is the fight or flight response, the release of norepinephrine, epinephrine. Also, part of this physiological response are cortisol, the pituitary adrenal response, which involves releasing cortisol. Um, just helps a powerful stress steroid. It helps our bodies manage stress. Um, you know, studies that have studies where they remove the pituitary glands or their adrenal glands of rats. They find that these rats have difficulty dealing with stress. They essentially sort of shut down in response to stressful situations. And this is thought in part due to the fact that these rats are unable to release cortisol because of their having their adrenal glands removed. Now, this physiological response, this is really useful to us. Again, we sort of mentioned this when we talked about sympathetic nervous system several weeks ago. Physiological responses to stress are useful. They help us to manage stress in our environment toward aiding survival. Right, we talked about this idea that some of the um, upsides for this kind of stress response are you're able to sort of increase, you're able to run away, you're able to escape. There's sort of increased activity in your muscle tissue. But this is also associated with decreased immune response, decreased regular bodily maintenance. So the idea here is that physiological responses to stress are a double-edged sword. These responses sort of evolved to help us out of stressful situations that we might encounter. But for our evolutionary past, those stressful situations were not relatively constant. We are not in a relatively constant state of stress as many people are today. And as we'll see later on, prolonged exposure to stress is actually bad for your body. It has negative health outcomes, especially for children. So, when we are exposed to some kind of stressful situation, we have a physiological response, but we also have a psychological response. And our psychological response depends in part on our evaluation of the situation, right? How we think about the source of stress. Now, there are two ways, or there are two levels at which you can think about this. There's sort of the primary appraisal and the secondary appraisal. The primary appraisal is our initial evaluation and meaning of the stressor. Essentially, we're asking the question, does this matter to me? Is this something that matters to me? Then the next question we ask is this a harm or a loss, a threat, or a challenge? Right, again, there's two ways that we can sort of we can envision in this. Harm is let's see. Harm is when so harm is typically a negative event that's already occurred. So this is you've receive a call from your landlord saying, oh, guess what? The landlord hasn't paid the bills, and so you're going to be evicted, right? This is something that has already happened to you. This is some kind of negative event. A threat we can sort of see as the potential for future harm. And a challenge is a potential for future growth, right? Something that we can sort of surmount. If you have an exam, you can see this as sort of a challenge. One way you can appraise that stressful event of an exam is a challenge. The secondary appraisal is what can I do? What is there anything I can do about this? What are my response options? And this has to do with the kinds of resources that you have available to you. So these resources can be things like energy resources, your just physical ability to respond. These can also be things like social resources, friends and family, monetary or financial resources. All of the resources that you have available to you to sort of deal with this particular stressor. So if you imagine you are your landlord didn't pay the mortgage and now you are going to be evicted and you didn't, no one communicated this to you at all. And so you have a couple days to find a new place to live, right? You might begin by evaluating this as a threat, potentially as a loss. And then your secondary appraisal is, okay, what can I do about this situation, right? Who do I know that I can sleep on their couch? Or, do I have enough money to rent a storage unit while I look for a place? Do I have rights potentially that I can exercise to stay in my current place a little bit longer while I look for a place? All of these things are potential resources that you can use to respond to the situation. Now, a lot of people think about stress as being bad, but stress in and of itself is not bad. Stress can actually be can be good. So positive stress is the optimal amount of physiological arousal that motivates us towards some goal. Right? A little bit of stress can actually improve your performance, right? It's actually useful for you to be a little bit stressed out about an exam or a paper or something that you have to do for class, for example, because this small amount of stress actually motivates you to work to alleviate that stress, right? So if you appraise, a paper that you have to write for a class as a challenge, right? You're a little bit stressed out about this paper. In order to meet that challenge, you go to the library and you start working on that paper, right? So this is actually useful. So for example, a successful math test, right? I've got to know everything I've got to apply everything that I know. You appraise as a challenge. You study, right? You're aroused and focused. You're aroused and focused, and you do well on the exam. That stress sort of helps you to meet that challenge. Alternatively, negative stress, you become so physiologically aroused, you become so stressed about the situation that actually demotivates you and hinders your ability to achieve something. I have a stressful math test. I don't understand this. I'm no good at math. Pardon me. And so you become stressed to distraction. Look, there's no point in studying. I'm going to fail no matter what I do. I don't know any of this. And I'm just going to, zone out and watch television as a way to cope with this stress. Right? So the point here is that not all stress is bad. It depends on your level of appraisal and level of arousal. Right? If you appraise it as a challenge and you have a moderate amount of arousal, this is what we would consider positive stress. If you appraise this as a threat, a harm, or a loss, and you have a high degree of arousal, then we would say that this is negative stress. Now, stress can come from external sources. So these can be things like catastrophes, right? So 9/11, was a very stressful time for many people, the people who were living in Manhattan around that time, but also the people around the country who are watching these events unfold on the news. We can also have major life events as being significant stress, so graduating, getting married, moving, a death in the family, all of these things can be stressful. And then daily hassles, right? Irritating or frustrating experiences, right? Standing in line, really bad traffic, really bad noise, really high temperatures, all of these things can be sources of stress. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that when you look at this list of stressful events, right, the things that we experience the most frequently are these daily hassles. Like sometimes we get married, sometimes we get to move and we have stress due to these major life events. Less frequently we have major catastrophes, but more often than not, our stress in our lives have to do with these daily hassles, these sorts of irritating or frustrating experiences. Also, personality can influence stress. So there are certain kinds of people who tend to just stress a little bit more than others. We call these people type A people. They're people who are, driven, easily angered. They're always in a hurry, ambitious, high achieving, but also aggressively reactive, right? So these are people who are on high alert all the time. You can think of their physiological activity as being in that sort of zone of stress no matter what they're doing. Now, this is not inherently bad. These people get a lot of stuff done. They tend to be very successful people, but they also tend to have more health problems, as we'll talk about later on. You can contrast this to type B people. These are people who are relaxed and easygoing, and they don't really have an overarching sense. They don't really have an overarching sense of urgency. So you can imagine these two people, Donald Trump and Matthew McConaughey, here in traffic, right? So when Donald Trump is in traffic, assuming he's driving himself and he's not in a limo somewhere, he gets very upset. He gets increasingly agitated. He's thinking about all of the things that he has to do and all the amount of time that is being wasted. He gets very, very angry and starts honking his horn and trying to do everything that he can to get out of this situation. This type B person stuck in traffic, right, might begin by being a little bit frustrated, but just realizes that there's not a lot they can do, and that there's no real reason to get upset about this. And so maybe they think constructive ways to use their time, perhaps getting on their phone and checking their email, perhaps getting on the phone and having a conversation with a family member just to sort of pass the time. Another internal source of stress can be frustration. So when we talk about frustration, we're talking about being prevented from reaching a goal. So frustration can be external, right? So these are things that are completely outside of your control. But they can also be internal, right? These are things that are personal limitations, right? I might be frustrated because I will never be an astronaut. I do not have the physical capabilities to pass all of the physical tests that one would need to pass in order to be an astronaut. Right? That's a personal limitation. I physically can't do it. External sources of stress can be things like traffic, right? Completely outside of your control. There's nothing you can do about the fact that someone got in an accident on the Dan Ryan and now you can't get to work or to school. Frustration leads to aggression, can lead to aggression. So oftentimes when people are frustrated, when people are stressed, one way that they can respond is by behaving aggressively toward the perceived source of that stress. There's a link here to an old movie called Falling Down with Michael Douglas. It's a very good example of the relationship between frustration and aggression. So if you're interested, you can check that out. Now, as I mentioned earlier, stress is this sort of double-edged sword. There are positive effects to stress, but also negative effects to stress. And the negative effects of prolonged stress are things like psychogenic diseases, right? If you are consistently stressed out, if you're this sort of type A personality, you are on high physiological arousal all the time, right? Over time, this can develop into things like ulcers and migraines. This can exacerbate heart disease. It decreases your immune function, and actually can lead to cancer. Part of your body's natural mechanisms to fight cancer by cleaning up cells, by removing bad portions of DNA, these sorts of things, can be interrupted by this sort of high stress environment. And so you have this weakened immune system that can reduce your body's ability to fight off infections, reduce your body's ability to prevent the development of cancer. So there's a really fun sort of experiment that illustrates this idea of the effects of stress on the body. Some researchers were interested in how stress affects the rate of healing. So when someone has a small injury, the rate of healing. And what they did was they took dental students. So these are students who are in school to become dentists. And they divided them up. They randomly assigned them to two groups. One group was the summer group. The other group was the final exam group. And what they did was they gave each person in these two groups a little puncture wound, like a small little puncture wound. That's the only way I can describe it. A small little wound. And what they did was they measured the amount of time that it took them to heal. Now, for the summer group, they gave these dental students this wound in the summertime, and for the final exam group, they gave these students the little wound around final exam time. Now, you would assume that final exams are relatively more stressful compared to the summertime for these students. And what they found was that the dental students who got the little wound around final exam time took significantly longer to heal than the students who got the little wound around the summertime. And what this suggests is that being in this state of stress decreases your body's ability to heal itself. It takes longer to heal because it has to divert more of its resources to this stressful situation. So there's tons of stress-related health problems. Again, this idea that our chronic interpretation of events in our lives can lead to increased physiological stress, which can lead to things like high blood pressure, fatigue, insomnia, all sorts of things. What's really, really interesting, sort of the forefront of the literature these days, is that prolonged exposure to stress is actually especially problematic for kids. And they talk about this as toxic stress. So adverse experiences sustained for a period of time, especially for children. What they find is that children are relatively unable to manage this kind of stress by themselves. And if their stress response system is activated for a prolonged amount of time, this can actually change the development of their brain. It can alter their course of development and ultimately change the way that they see the world, making them more sensitive to stress, making them see the world as a more hostile and dangerous kind of place. And this can have long-term consequences. So kids who are exposed to prolonged stress tend to see the world as more hostile. They respond more aggressively, but they also have deficits in cognitive impairment. So, for example, children who are exposed to high levels of stress hormones as children, what they find is that they end up with a relatively smaller hippocampus. Recall that we talked about the hippocampus is important for memory. And what this suggests is that this prolonged exposure to stress actually decreases cognitive function for these kids. Now, this can be mitigated by supportive, responsive relationships. So, as I mentioned earlier, children are sort of unable to manage the effects of stress on their own, and if they have adults in their lives to help them manage that stress, they can reduce some of these damaging effects. But stress is prolonged, consistent stress in childhood is associated with all sorts of unpleasant side effects as these kids get older. So how do we deal with stress? There's a few different ways that we can deal with stress. We can cope emotionally and behaviorally. When we talk about coping, we're usually talking about stress that's considered a harm or a loss or a threat. We're not really talking about challenges. And the source of stress, the kind of stress, may determine the kinds of coping methods we can employ. So problem-focused coping is addressing the stressor directly and actively, right? This is trying to change something about the situation itself. So perhaps you are stressed out because you are constantly late for class, and this is making it difficult for you to do as well as you'd like in the class, and so you realize the reason why you're late is because your boss keeps you after work. You have a shift that just isn't working with your schedule, and so a problem-focused coping mechanism would be to try and change that shift at work, right? To try and change the situation to reduce the stress. Right, so if you're not doing well in the class and you perceive this as a threat, maybe you start coming to class more, maybe you start studying more. Again, you're actively doing things to address the stressor directly, right? Now, emotion-focused coping is trying to reduce the negative emotional effects of stress. So for emotion-focused coping, you're not really trying to change the source of the stress. You're trying to reduce the impact that stress has on you, right? So you can do this by seeking social support, by trying to distract yourself or ignore the source of the stressor. So if you think of this in terms of traffic, looking at your phone, ignoring the fact that you're going to be late to a meeting, doing sorts of other things to just say, well, it's going to be okay. I'm not going to lose my job because of this traffic, that kind of thing. And this can be beneficial. So, for example, one major finding about people who suffer a heart attack is that after their first heart attack, there's an increased likelihood that they'll have a second heart attack, and this can be particularly stressful and anxiety-provoking. And what they find is that people who ignore the anxiety, right, who sort of evaluate the situation as a one-off, right? Yes, I had this heart attack, but I don't think I'm going to have one in the future, and I'm changing my behavior. I'm doing all these sorts of things. But by ignoring this anxiety, they actually reduce the likelihood that they would end up having this second heart attack. By decreasing the anxiety, by changing the emotional effects of that stress, they reduce the likelihood of a secondary heart attack. But it can also, emotion-focused coping can be detrimental, right? If you're stressed about a final exam and you try to reduce these negative effects by just ignoring or deciding that you no longer care, going out with your friends to a bar instead of studying, right? These things are sort of negative aspects of ignoring or distracting yourself. So when you are employing a problem-focused coping strategy, there's an assumption here that you actually have control over the situation. And emotion-focused coping strategies assume that you don't necessarily have direct control over the situation. Now, it's important to note that you always have control over how you think about the situation. We'll talk about this here in a minute. But the more control of a situation that you have, more control you have over a situation, the less stress you experience. And loss of control is associated with increased stress. So, for example, in this study with rats, they set up two scenarios. So both rats are in this little cage. They can't really move, and both are hooked up to a little wire that will give them a little shock on their tail. Mild shock, I think sort of strong static electricity shock kind of thing. And they break this up into two groups, the executive rat and the subordinate rat. And the executive rat, when they get the shocks, they can actually spin the little wheel in front of them, and this will stop the shocks. Right? So they give them this sense of control. For the subordinate rat, no matter how much they spin that little wheel, the shocks still keep coming, right? And what they find is that this subordinate rat has higher levels of sort of higher overall levels of cortisol, more likely to develop ulcers, more likely to experience a weakened immune system associated with prolonged stress. And so what this study shows is that control is directly related to stress. So both rats got the same amount of shocks, except the executive rat perceived that they had some degree of control over those shocks. And so what this shows is that as control decreases, stress increases and your health decreases. So healthy ways to manage stress, exercise. So exercise is associated with all sorts of positive benefits, reduces stress, anxiety, and depression, reduces blood pressure, reduces risk for heart disease. Right? There's all kinds of positive effects of stress, of exercise. And it's important to note that this exercise doesn't need to be strenuous exercise. You don't need to run 5 miles to get the benefits of these exercises. Simply choosing to take the stairs every day at your job. Let's say, in order to go up to the break room, there's 2 flights of stairs, and usually you take the elevator, and you decide you're going to take the stairs from now on. Right? Simple changes like that. Walking instead of driving, to the corner store, or taking the stairs whenever possible, can count as increased aerobic exercise, and you can see some of these positive health effects. Relying on social support is also important. So people who perceive that they have support from their family members, from their friends, actually have significant reductions in the impact of stress. Other important things to consider when we think about stress. Remember, we talked about this idea that we're always in control of how we think about stress in our lives. So explanatory style is another indicator of stress. People who make external, local, unstable attributions for negative events in their lives tend to manage stress a little bit better, don't suffer the negative effects of prolonged stress as people with a pessimistic coping style or explanatory style. Right, so people who are optimists feel like they're in more control, they tend to be happier. People who are pessimists tend to experience more stress. Again, important to note, so we may not necessarily have control over how we experience situations. We may not be able to change the stressor itself, but we can change our evaluation or response to the stress. So one thing we talk about is cognitive restructuring. The idea of cognitive restructuring is taking stress-provoking thoughts and replacing them with more constructive ones. Right? By paying attention to our inner monologue, by thinking about how we are thinking about thinking. By thinking about how we are thinking about some kind of stressful event, we can change negative thoughts and erroneous beliefs and reframe your perspective on the situation. And so a lot of these things are involved not overgeneralizing, right? So don't draw broad conclusions from single events, right? You fail one math test, that does not mean that you are bad at math, right? It just means that maybe you need to study more, right? So challenging these erroneous beliefs, focusing on failures, right? Yes, I failed this math test, but really I've been doing pretty well in school besides, and so I'm a pretty good student, right? So not focusing on failures, making attributions to the situation as opposed to the self, right? I failed the math test because I didn't study hard enough, not because I am physically bad at math. Avoiding all or none kind of thinking, and trying to take a problem-focused approach if possible, are all ways that you can sort of reframe the situation to sort of reduce the negative effects of the stress. Okay. So that's it for stress and health. Next week, we'll begin our topic on psychological disorders.